alumni and the Friends of Fondren Library, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture with Lisa Balabanlilar. I've been practicing it all day, and I love Lisa. The thing is, I've met her many times, and I was like, I must get this name correct. So the thumbs up means a lot. So she's a Ph.D. and author of The Emperor Jahangir. Thank you. Power and Kingship in Mughal India. We were delighted you have joined us. We will begin the lecture tonight, followed by Q&A afterwards. We'll move down the hall to the Brown Fine Arts Library for a reception. We ask you to please wear a mask during the lecture portion of the evening. And now I will turn over the podium to our Friends of Fondren board member, Virginia Clark, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening. I welcome you all here. Isn't it delightful to be able to be here in person after 2+ years of COVID? And I will soon introduce Dr. Balabanlilar, but first a message from our sponsor. Friends of Fondren Library is pleased to sponsor this event with the Association of Rice Alumni tonight. If you would like to support these events, please consider joining our library membership group, Friends of Fondren Library. You can please go to library.rice.edu, or we will have forms available after the talk. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Lisa Balabanlilar. She is a full professor in both the Departments of History and the Department of Transnational Asian Studies at Rice University. She is also the chair of the Department of Transnational Asian Studies and the director of the Chao Center on Asian Studies. That sounds like a very cool place to me.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. She teaches South and Central Asian history, the history of the Mughal Empire, modern Islamic empires, and also the history of the fabled Silk Road. And she is a fabulous teacher. In 2016, she was awarded Rice's highest teaching order, the George R. Brown Award for Excellence in Teaching. She also received in 2014 and 2018 George R. Brown Awards for Superior Teaching and a Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Award in 2010. And her area of interest is the Timurid-Mughal Empire in South and Central Asia. She looks at comparative court studies with Islamic empires and the early modern period. She received her doctorate at the Ohio State University in 2007 and joined Rice at that time. Dr. Balabanlilar has published many articles on Islamic kingship in India, royal court culture, gardens, and the hunt. Her first book, Imperial Identity in the Mughal Empire, Memory and Dynastic Politics in Early Modern South and Central Asia, was published in 2012. And her latest book, The Emperor Jahangir, Power and Kingship in Mughal Empire, was released in 2020 and paperback in 2021. She is currently working on a world history of imperial pleasure gardens and a history of the Mughal Empire. I first heard Dr. Balabanlilar at a summer lecture she gave at the Glasscock School several years ago on the Timurids. It was absolutely fascinating. It was about a place and a time and a people that I knew practically nothing about, other than that the word Mughal comes from Mughal. It indicates very wealthy person. Judge the jewels on that slide. It was so interesting when I saw in the Rice Alumni News that this book had been published. I decided I had to read it and went and got it. And we will be giving away several copies of that book after the please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Balabanlilar.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. This is so exciting. Can you hear me okay? I have a lapel microphone. Great. So thanks everyone for coming this afternoon, this evening. I'm usually mobile, but because of all the cords here, I'm going to try to stay behind the podium a little bit, but then during the Q&A I'll jump out and do perhaps some sort of interpretive dance for you, Mughal style. I do want to thank the Friends of Fondren and the Association of Rice Alumni for inviting me to give the talk and for the opportunity to share my work, because it came out in the middle of the lockdown. I haven't been able to celebrate it much, so this is very fun. So as a scholar, as Virginia so kindly described, my interest lies in the questions of kingship and the negotiations of power. In particular, I'm interested in the phenomenon of Islamic rule in Hindu India, the period we call early modern. This is a complicated way of describing things, but for me this means the centuries roughly between 1500 and 1800. I get to 1800, I get very nervous. Modernity is not my thing at all. The questions I ask are mostly centered on how kingship is understood, what actions are expected of a king, and how kingship is defended. How might a king or a dynasty, for that matter, convince their subjects that they are the legitimate ruler of that territory? It's a complicated package. So the founding father of the Mughal dynasty, Jahangir Muhammad Babur, see if it works here, one of my boys, was born in Central Asia in 1483 in Fergana. I don't know if anyone's been to Uzbekistan. He was a Muslim, Turkish, Mongol descendant of both Timur, Tamerlane, and Genghis Khan. Timur on his father's side, Genghis Khan on his mother's side, forced out of his kingdom in the early 16th century by a different royal branch of the Mongols coming from the Russian steppes, who will be known to history forevermore as the Uzbeks. Babur settled first in Afghanistan, in Kabul. This is why that map is up. If you look at the very north, in the green, you'll see his capital city was Kabul, and he'd come there from Samarkand, which was temporarily his capital. And then he pushed into northern India, which he conquered in 1526. So for context, I just want to remind you that in fact northern India had been ruled for the last several hundred years, since about 1200 or 1300, by a series of Muslim, Afghani, and Turkish dynasties. He will supplant them and build his own dynasty in the subcontinent. They'll last in power for about 200 years and remain as somewhat toothless rulers in Delhi and the Red Fort until 1858. So one of the many reasons why I personally have found the Mughals so fascinating and why I jumped on the opportunity to work with them when I was in graduate school is that this dynasty, several members of the dynasty composed their own memoirs. This is, again, very much in line with this desire to justify your kingship and explain your legitimacy, right, to the people you rule and especially your aristocracy. Personal memoir is extraordinarily unusual in the pre-modern period. And Babur, while conquering a new kingdom and writing some not very bad poetry in Turkish, wrote what is considered by many to be the first autobiography in the Islamic world. His daughter would write a memoir, his cousin would write a memoir, many of their courtiers would write, and his great-grandson, my fellow Jahangir, would do the same. And what makes these manuscripts unique for their time is the author's willingness to present themselves as complex, as creative, as idiosyncratic. In so doing, Babur made an argument for power that was really specific and very personal. His writings, which sometimes give us shocking detail about his own weaknesses, his failures, his misjudgments, his crush on another boy who he sees in the village, his tears after losing a battle. As he's very intimate with the reader. But it was all directed at building a case for his personal leadership. So 75 years after he dies, his great-grandson, the Emperor Jahangir, newly and insecurely enthroned, would begin writing his own account of his life in an effort to reinvent himself, to justify his ascension, to defend the legitimacy of his inheritance of the throne. And take my word for it, he needed a lot of defending. Of course, I've already talked right past the slide. I do want to point out the gorgeous battle scenes, and I don't intend to talk much about Mughal painting, but it's amazing and glorious, and if you have questions afterwards, I'd love to talk about it. Here's my board. This is Jahangir. For one thing, one of the reasons he was a weak king initially, or he's been perceived as a weak king, is because he fit in between two of the most important scions of the Mughal dynasty. His father was Akbar the Great, who ruled for nearly 50 years, and had, at a very young age, been able to seize control of a territory, defend it, expand it into a massive empire that became the second wealthiest in the world. Following Jahangir's death, his son will inherit the throne, and as the Emperor Shah Jahan, who is a solid warrior and kind of a jerk, but he's the guy who builds the Taj Mahal. So Jahangir is stuck in the middle as this kind of placeholder guy. But it gets worse than that, because in a dynasty of expansionists and warriors, Jahangir's military adventures are generally successful, but not creative and not superlative. To make things much, much worse, he was a heavy drinker, an alcoholic, and a drug user who publicly agonized over his own health and sobriety. He kept no secret of it. His reputation was further marred by his own violent rebellion against his father, Akbar. And even the ability and influence of his powerful wife, Nur Jahan, would be used by his successors, by dynastic chroniclers, and even modern historians to diminish the prestige of her husband. Her strength, I mean, strong women get this all the time, right? Her strength is often used by historians to illustrate a contrast between them and reinforce his reputation for incompetence or ineffectual indolence. So I opened my book with a quote from one of the most important translators and historians of Mughal India in the 20th century, Henry Beveridge, who, having read an earlier biography of Jahangir, wrote, "Now that the author of this biography has in some manner exhausted the subject of Jahangir, it doesn't seem likely or necessary that there should ever be another book about this emperor. We can say the world has now learned all we need to know about him. He was a poor creature and owes his celebrity only to his position." So, of course, I count Jahangir's reign in some ways to be quite a success. He did expand imperial territory. He maintained very strong diplomatic relations with rivals, including the Safavids of Iran and the Sultanates of the Deccan. He actively supported an extraordinary degree of religious diversity across the empire. And under his patronage, the royal workshops produced paintings that some consider representing a golden age of Indian art. I am among them. So it seemed to me that anyone this flawed and this gifted and this complicated required further investigation. And of course, his memoirs, this kind of irresistible window into the cultural understandings and values of the royal court and his territories in South Asia. So let me talk briefly about that memoir. I'm going to grab my phone because I don't have access to a clock, and I have a very strong feeling that I'm going to overtalk if I don't rein myself in. So the memoir, for 17 years, started with his ascension to the throne in 1605. Jahangir wrote in the form of chronological diary, not every day, maybe once or twice a week, beginning each new year with the Persian New Rose Spring Festival. Babur had written his memoir in Chagatai Turkish. Although Persian was the elite language of the region, but he was aiming for this Central Asian, Turkish, and Mongol audience. Jahangir will write in Persian because the royal courts of Central Asia and northern India at that time used it exclusively among the elites. He called his volume the Iqbal Nama, which means the auspicious story, but more often he referred to his own manuscript as Jahangir Nama, the story of Jahangir. So in 1522, there's a little detail for historians here. He hands over the writing to his munshi, his secretary, Muhammad Khan, and yet they collaborate as they continue to write it together. And the style is exactly the same. You would never know that somebody else had taken over the writing, other than that Jahangir tells us he's done this. In 1624, a few years before he dies, the writing suddenly stops. It's incomplete, it finishes. And so about 100 years later, a courtier at the Mughal royal court, working in the library of the Mughals, which was extensive. We know that, for example, during Akbar's time, they had at least 20,000 books in their library. This scholar going through these old manuscripts pulls together from other writings a beginning for Jahangir's memoir that describes his birth and his childhood, and an ending that describes his death. So we have no doubts about the authorship of these various sections. And partly because contemporaries describe seeing this manuscript in Jahangir's presence, and he gave away copies of a few times unfinished, like 7 years in and 12 years in. He's gifting copies of his memoir to his sons, to some of his courtiers. He even ships them off to the Sultan in Istanbul. And he says, these are going to be great advice for kings, right? We're going to learn how to be a good king by reading my memoir, which I have to say is quite a lark, because it's quite a volume. So the point is that even though it's quite an intimate and personal volume, it is intended as a public document. This is an important point to make. So we have to be really careful in reading it. It reads sometimes in a way that is very intimate. And of course, he does publicly talk about his alcoholism, his drug use, his fights with his sons, mistakes he's made, bad legal decisions he's offered. He's quite willing to tear his own self apart. But it was always intended to be read by the public. And so we have to be very cautious and know that Jahangir is carefully narrating his own interpretation of events. So my approach to the book, I didn't want to simply just write the narrative story of his life, which is interesting, but it's not a rollicking adventure story. So what I've done is hang the book on kind of chronological narrative, but within each section, I do a deep dive into some of the themes and ideas that seem to be most interesting in his life. Things like his political relationships, his military campaigns, his religion, his support for religious diversity, which he writes about a lot, his imperial patronage of the arts, his marriages, many, many marriages, and the power of elite women, in particular that of his favorite wife, Noor Jahan. So let me just give you a short kind of description of his ascension to the throne and set things up. And then I'll only talk about a few of the major themes of the book because of time. So because she's so interesting and because she's such a problem for him, I'll talk a bit about Noor Jahan. And then I'll talk about some of my newer research that is coming out of this book. So, some background. It's clear from his own writing, but also from other sources, including the writings of the Jesuits, who were actually embedded in his father's and in Jahangir's court, who actually trained princes, did translations, and were hoping like mad to be able to convert these guys to Christianity, very unsuccessfully. But it's clear from all of these sources that Jahangir's relationship with his father was a mix of resentment, rivalry, and admiration. Right? Akbar had inherited this very fragile kingdom at the age of 13 and managed to turn it into a massive empire. There she is. I embarrass my students when they come in late too. Don't get personally happy. Including what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. So by the time his 3 sons were born, he was an entrenched and powerful king. And it's clear that his personality awed and intimidated all of his sons, raised to assume the mantle of kingship, but tightly controlled by a very powerful father. The princes struggled to keep their ambitions in check. And in adulthood, all 3 would find refuge in alcohol, among other acts of opposition. So Jahangir was the oldest, and he would go into rebellion at the age of 29, setting himself up in a separate, independent royal court in Allahabad, where the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers meet, claiming independence, claiming total sovereignty. He would rule Allahabad until 1604. And although this act seems extremely provocative, in fact, Akbar negotiated it very sensitively. So even at one point when Jahangir marches on his father's capital at Agra with an army of 30,000, Akbar just kind of waits for him to get nearby and says, "Go home now." And Jahangir kind of panics and runs away. So Akbar handles this pretty well, but in the meantime, Jahangir is in Allahabad drinking very, very heavily and behaving badly. But his 2 younger brothers were equally messy. So poor Akbar, he's got 3 sons, but they're all wretched. And the 2 younger boys would in fact die of alcoholism. Murad will die in 1599, Danyal dies in 1604. So ultimately, this poor, powerful, magnificent king is stuck with this one viable successor. So when Jahangir finally returns to the royal court under the premise of coming to his grandmother's funeral, he is welcomed back. He's not treated as a criminal, although once he's inside, Akbar locks him up for 10 days to detoxify him. So obviously there's some hesitation about whether or not he could be Akbar's successor. His oldest son, Jahangir's oldest son, Khusrau, was seen as a suitable candidate. So there is a competition for the inheritance. Akbar suddenly falls ill and is dying almost immediately after Jahangir returns. Khusrau and Jahangir negotiate a network with all of the nobility, and finally Jahangir pulls together enough of a support system so that Akbar passes on the throne to him and dies. And Jahangir becomes the new emperor in 1605. By the way, let me just talk about this painting very briefly. This was done in Allahabad when he is a prince who's claiming to be a sovereign. And you can see how performative this painting is. He is a bit dwarfed by his throne, but the thrones of the Muslim kings were these big platforms in this way, but powerful and in control, and very young, and attempting to look really like a tough guy. So when he actually becomes the king, he pivots to a policy of very public devotion and emulation of Akbar. It was another painting. This is Jahangir holding a painting of his father, Akbar, gazing at it with admiration. So all of these years of rebellion and fighting and threatening, as soon as he's taken the throne, he takes kingship very seriously. He settles down immediately. And he develops a governing system that's based entirely on his father's administration. So he's going to uphold the state protection of non-Muslim communities within his territory. and carefully demonstrate in very public ways his adherence to justice, even making himself regularly available in public to be a judicial arbiter for his subjects in sometimes really generous and interesting ways. I'm really going to run out of time. Let me just jump ahead and say that within the year, his son Khusrau, who thought he might grab the throne, also will go into rebellion. He's pissed off, he's frustrated, he jumps into war, and I think he's assuming that the nobility that supported him when he and Jahangir were competitors at Akbar's court, he's just assumed that they would jump in and help him, and they don't. At this point, Jahangir's a done deal. So he grabs his crowd of followers and starts looting Agra, rushes up to Lahore, which is one of the most important cities of the Mughal Empire, loots Lahore and starts heading northwest. Jahangir's freaked out by this, very concerned, but then he realizes that Khusrau is not getting a lot of support and is not going to be successful. So there's this really interesting moment he's writing about in his own memoirs, chasing after his son, and he's got kind of a sense of humor at this point. And he says, I'm chasing after this damn kid in the noonday heat. It's very warm. I'm too old for this. And he says, I'm suffering even more than normal because I have missed my daily dose of opium. But if I feel this bad, imagine how bad he feels. He's missed his opium for days. In any case, the rebellion is easily quashed. And Jahangir will stay in Lahore for some time, and then he travels up to the Afghan city of Kabul. Now, Kabul used to be Babur's capital, so this is kind of a pilgrimage for Jahangir. He'll go through the city and visiting all of the sites that Babur had built or talked about in his memoir. And out of this journey, my interest in the journey comes from this really important theme that emerges, and that is Jahangir's really deep and emotional connection with the natural landscape in South Asia. The journey up to Kabul had geopolitical reasons behind it, but he's going to go very slowly. It's going to take him 2 months to get from Lahore to Kabul. Why? Because he's drifting, he's dawdling, and you realize here's a guy whose entire adult life has been spent following orders, leading armies, governing provinces, at the beck and call of his father. This is his first opportunity to linger. And he does the most amazing things. He comes to this gorgeous lake with beautiful waterfalls, and there are oleander bushes, and he says in his memoir, I demanded that all of my retinue, we were talking about tens of thousands of people, that all of them take a bit of oleander and put it in their turban so we would look like a walking garden. And if you don't do it, I'm going to knock your turban off your head. And then he comes to a beautiful waterfall and he sits and he drinks wine, and he sees that the local people are fishing with a kind of funny net. So he stops, the whole royal court camps out while he learns to fish with the local net. He finally catches about 15 fish with his own hands, and he's in this dreamy world of his own, and he puts pearls in their noses and releases them back into the lake. So he's going to get back to Agra, he's going to perform kingship, he's going to get married, create diplomatic relationships, do all the things he's supposed to do. The European visitors at his court describe his drinking at the royal court on a regular basis. So in the evenings, he will have a kind of smaller, more intimate gathering with his noblemen, to which a lot of these Europeans are invited, interestingly, including the first British ambassador to India, Sir Thomas Roe, who spends 3 years with Jahangir. And he comes to this evening gathering at night. He says the emperor sits and just drinks wine until he finally falls asleep on his throne. And all the business of the empire is done at these times, unless, Thomas Roe says, unless it is prevented by the drowsiness which possess His Majesty from the fumes of Bacchus. So we know he was drunk nearly daily. He talks about it in his memoir. He writes that at the age of 30, he was drinking so heavily and eating so little food that his hands continually shook. He was so dissipated, he needed servants to hold the cup for him. And finally, his father's doctor comes and says, "You're going to die in 6 months if you don't stop drinking so much." So very proudly, this emperor says, "Yeah, I cut way back. I'm only drinking 6 glasses of wine a day. But in addition to that, to make up the difference, I'm drinking this opiate-based cocktail too. And I've been holding steady with this for 15 years and I'm doing great." So it's when he's in Agra after this first trip to Kabul that he marries for the last time to this woman who is the daughter of a Persian immigrant. And he's been married already many times. Probably, as we historians have identified, at least 20 marriages. So the idea here is obviously to have a lot of children and to form political alliances, but then he meets this 35-year-old widow with a daughter, falls passionately in love and marries her and never marries another woman again. But this is where in the book, for example, I dive down into what the hell is happening with 20 marriages, right? I mean, we all know that imperial marriages in the pre-modern period have 2 primary purposes, really, if you're a royal. Right? Still true, I think, for the royals. You want to reinforce diplomatic and political alliances with marriage, and you want to produce a lot of babies. And in the Islamic world, religion's law limits marriages to 4. We know this, right? Which is still a much more generous allowance than is given to European kings, the Christian kings. But for these ambitious empire builders, 4 is not enough. It really limits their power and their potential for healthy heirs, right? So a lot of different royal families come up with alternatives. The Ottomans, for example, had become so powerful by the 16th century that you can imagine they simply did not need diplomatic alliances through marriage anymore. And the big negative to those relationships is the fathers and brothers-in-law who may have their own ambition. Right? So the Ottomans essentially, for the most part, with very few exceptions, give up on marriage utterly and develop a system of concubinage, which produces all of the scions of the dynasty. So the Ottoman sultans are all born of slave women from that point, who are relatively anonymous much of the time. They're the only ones doing that. They're the only ones who get away with it. But meanwhile, the Central Asian Turkish ancestors of the Mughals, the Timur and his descendants, were marrying mostly for diplomatic and political reasons, partly because shortly after Timur's death, they are very weak and vulnerable. But women in Turkish and Mongol tradition also, royal women, elite women, not just any woman, carry a lot of political charisma in their lineage, which they bring to a marriage. So they're not just there to produce children, they bring political weight. They even could bring armies with them. For example, Babur will be able to call on some Mongol armies that are associated with his mother's line when he is fighting for power in Central Asia. So famously, Timur married a few of the women who were descended from Genghis Khan, because they still have this political weight to them. They have a lot of power that comes from this lineage. And when he marries these women, although it's many generations after Genghis Khan's death, he takes the title Good Khan, or Good Again, which means the son-in-law. And that becomes the family name. You'll see, even in the 19th century, the descendants of the Mughals are using Good Ken or Good Again as their last name. So for Timur and his descendants, marital alliances are so important that the Quranic regulations get entirely thrown out. They are Muslim, but needs must, right? So almost no limits to the amount of wives a prince could have. We know that Timur was married at one time to at least 7 women. Babur will have been married to at least 11. Some of them are political alliances, some of them strategic, some are family, like cousins' marriage is very important to hold dynasties together, and some are passionate love affairs. But they're all legal marriages in a formal sense. So this kind of extraordinary marital flexibility sets the Mughals apart in India. They continue to ignore the requirement that 4 wives be the maximum. Akbar, though, Jahangir's father, will create a new form of marriage. His 3rd marriage is going to be to Harka Bai, who is the daughter of his closest Rajput ally, the Hindu Rajput princes of the north, from Amber, near Jaipur, where Jaipur is now. If you've been to Amber Fort, that's the place. So the Raja had established close alliances with Akbar when Akbar was only 14. So 5 years later, the Raja comes to him and says, marry my daughter, we can cement this relationship. Akbar from that point will continue to marry the women of all of the elite families of northern India. He's been accused of having at least 200 wives by his own courtiers. But this is a political strategy for him. He serially marries into all of the elite families of India, Muslim and non-Muslim, Turks, Mongols, Rajputs, Persians, all in an effort to create hegemony in the north. And this is not about sex. This is about political power. He's pulling their fathers and brothers into the political elite as he marries them. They become his critically important allies and his nobility. So for that reason, too, now we see that his wives are not required to convert to Islam. This is also highly unusual. So that we have a dynasty now that is multi-ethnic, multi-denominational. So Jahangir was married young and married very often. As I said, he probably had 20 wives. He met his last wife, Lisa, when she's a widow. And he gives her the title Nur Mahal, the light of the palace. And later she'll get the title Nur Jahan, the light of the world, which is a riff off of his regnal name, Jahangir, he who seizes the world, Jahan. The problem with, the problem with Nur Jahan is that she's described as being a political arrangement, a scheming woman. But we see in his memoir that Jahangir loved and respected her. There are some wonderful comments periodically. If you pick through the memoir, you find them where he's ill and he doesn't want to tell anyone because he's afraid it will destabilize the government. So he goes to Nur Jahan, he says, because she has more affection for me than anyone else. Right? And she's also his hunting partner. She's a great markswoman, famous for hunting. So he will even take her lion hunting, which is reserved for kings, and he'll let her fire the shots. He's so proud. In one event, she'll fire 5 shots and kill 4 lions, and he's ecstatic because he describes her in a swaying howdah on the back of an elephant, and this wonderful markswoman. He showers her with golden coins. So the foreign merchants who are trying to cut deals in India at that time complain of her power. And it's to their benefit to justify their own failures at the court, to accuse her of being this powerful enemy. I don't need to point out that in identifying the source of their political failures as the queen, that they are using a popular European trope, right, of an untrustworthy and manipulative femininity that undermined male power at the courts of the Islamic world. The reputation of Jahangir and Nur Jahan suffered badly also at the hands of his son. In order to justify his own rebellion, because Shah Jahan too will rebel against his father quite brutally. After Shah Jahan takes the throne, he'll describe Jahangir as weak and inept, and willing to allow this ambitious woman to take political control and take over the functions of government. It's very likely that these criticisms had much more to do with her being an ambitious outsider with a very complicated family. So these narratives of Jahangir's weakness and passivity get very widely disseminated and so entrenched in the scholarship that a 20th century biographer described Jahangir as a hard-hearted, fickle-minded tyrant soaked in wine and sunk in debauch, which he might not have minded, actually, I'm not sure. But what I found in looking through, in particular in this case, the Jesuit letters from his court and also Central Asian Sufi visitors to his court from Samarkand, in the few years just before his death, and they describe him as physically active and politically engaged. And it's hard to dislodge this narrative of this weak and undisciplined emperor, even in the face of this contradictory evidence. And I think in part because, looking at my scholar friends in the back, Orientalist themes of Eastern decadence and wily harem women are really powerful still even in the academic world. It's hard to let go of those fun stories. So this is the narrative that still defines him, hopefully less so at this point. And I'm really sorry, but I think I have to stop here, don't I? It's getting late, and I'm not going to be able to do all I can. To take questions. I have tons more to talk about, and I clearly, I babbled maybe a little much. Yes?
Didn't his battle with alcohol run contrary to Islamic teachings?
Yes, everything he's doing is running contrary to Islamic teachings. I will say, though, that this is certainly not uncommon. We all know what the idealized morality is in every religious system, and no one can suggest to me that Henry VIII performed great Christian, kingship. The Mughals were much less interested in following the dictates of conservative Islamic law. Marriages are a good clue. Alcoholism runs through the family. Obviously, it killed both of his brothers. It killed his uncle. It will kill many members of his dynasty. And the paintings, right? They are not necessarily, I'm sorry, I couldn't talk to you about all of this cool stuff, but, the interest in naturalism is supposed to be something that Islamic painters aren't allowed to really engage, but they find a passion in this. And these look like Ottoman paintings. They're all done during Jahangir's period.
Lisa, could you talk a little bit about where you do your research, where these documents exist?
Yes.
And if they're still in libraries?
Yeah, it's really problematic. So when the British left India, they took all the good stuff with them. So most of it is actually in London. The Baburnama, there are versions of it floating all over. There's a wonderful Japanese scholar who's done a volume in which he compared like 20 different manuscripts, and so I use that. It's in Persian and in Japanese, which I do not, of course, read, but I read Persian. So that's kind of an accumulation. Jahangir's Nama is the same. The primary volumes were in Iran, but they've been published in Persian from Tehran. So I have that. One of the worst things that can ever happen to a writer of books is just as I was finishing, a new manuscript was discovered in Iran. And it was brutal because it was very important. It was a courtier who stayed with Jahangir for years and wrote about the conversations they had every night as he's drinking wine and falling asleep. It's Abdel Sattar's Majlisi Jahangiri. And I had to stop dead in my tracks. and get someone in Tehran to send me a copy, and then read the damn thing in Persian, which took me about a year because it's huge, and then go back to the book. So they're everywhere, but a lot of the major manuscripts, Babur-nama, Jahangir-nama, are published and even really well translated. You can buy them both on Amazon in English. Good beach reading. Jaden.
I'm going to be the only person who has two questions. But so I want to think of Jahangir in the context of the family line. So when I read Babur-nama, what I'm struck by the most is because I've never wanted to be a political leader. It's like hunger, the kingdom, right? And obviously this guy wants to be a king too. Is this the same kind of hunger that Babur had, or is it something different? And second question is, clearly he had a very complicated relationship with his father. Did he try to be a better father?
That's a great question. First, the hunger issue. No, he's not another Babur. He's not ambitious, but he's trying to live up to his dad, basically. So most of his actions are an affirmation. Once he takes the throne, once Akbar's dead, then he can love him. And then he's going to emulate him and support all of his policies and frame himself as the legitimate successor. But in terms of ambition for territory, no. Babur wanted to be the next Timur, the Neo-Timurid Empire. He's trying to recreate what's been lost, and it's highly ambitious. But those Mongols from the Russian steppes are his nemesis. So he ends up in Kabul, and he's so ambitious. He writes across the region. He sends out letters saying, "Everybody come to me. I will be your leader. All of you exiled and refugee Timurids, descendants of Timur, should come to me in Kabul." But Kabul's really poor, so he writes about this in his book and says, I have all these people who are used to luxury and they're kind of spoiled brats and they're bitching all the time that they don't have enough stuff. I've got to keep pushing out. He's raiding Afghan tribal groups, and it's a mistake because then they attack him back, and he starts raiding into northern India simply because he's trying to accumulate wealth to be this great emperor. And so when he wins the battle in 1526 at Panipat and takes northern India, he's not too happy. I know you've read Babur-nama, he's not very happy. He doesn't like India. He says it doesn't have good culture, doesn't have good melons. No, he just wants to go home. But this ambition to be the new Timur, this is the land he has, so he's going to use it. Jahangir's not like that at all. He'd love to spend his whole life taking opium and drifting. I have a lovely, this one. Him on a boat. I mean, he's moving with 100,000 people at a time on this court progress through his territories, and he just can't stop. The question about him being a better father, no, he's a terrible father. Yeah, same problems.
The preceding screen, those animals and the European, was that just their cabinet of curiosities? What was that?
So Jahangir has an extraordinary curiosity about the natural world. And people know this about him. So if you want to impress him when you come to his court, you bring him gifts that are weird or valuable. Has to be weird or valuable. So you end up with this dodo bird, which probably came to the port at Goa. And scholars now believe this was painted to life, that there was a live dodo bird brought to the court because it's so well painted. And it's probably the last extant painting of a dodo bird ever in the world. But you can see the other weird things people brought him too, right? A North American turkey, and he describes it. He says this weird thing, this weird bird, and he talks about the wattle and the weird feathers. He says, it's so cool, I'm going to make my painters paint it for me. And we have the painting. And then he talks about the zebra. He says it was painted by the brush of God. These dramatic black and white stripes. There it is, there's the painting. And of course, equally weird is it's European. They're just now starting to come into India.
Why do you think the paintings are so
But the faces are in profile, even these animals, and it
Oh.
seems like most of them, there'll be one figure with three-quarter, but everybody.
Yeah, so at some certain times in the painting, the way the head is framed shows their political position, but in this case, its profiles are easier to paint in terms of perspective. So you see them doing these shortcuts all the time. It's got nothing to do with ideology. It's just like, oh, the nose goes here. It's easy. But they are very influenced by European paintings. I don't have any great examples here. But you can see that the shading and the shaping are present here, this dimensionality. And this is the influence of Christian visitors who brought religious paintings, the Jesuits. And the Mughals love this stuff, and they bring it to their painters' workshops and say, do this. Do you have a question? Okay, yes.
The Persian language that you were describing, is that the equivalent of Farsi, or is it precursor?
No, it's the same. It's the
Same.
same. You know, once the Shahnameh was written, why would you change that language at all? So it's pretty much the same language from the medieval period to now. Farsi is just another word for Persian.
I wanted to ask about, sorry to go back to the animals. I'm curious, so since we work in the same period, but just in very different parts of the globe, it's a moment in certainly England and Europe in which natural history, as it's often called, is actually quite widespread. There are lots of humanistic networks connected to folk of anywhere from middling all the way up to very royal status. It sounded like, and I just love to hear more about it, this is more of a fascination of a particular elite, like as in the elite, right, the emperor, or is it a more widespread phenomenon than the fascination?
Yeah, no, it is the elite. It's not widespread, but it's a large elite, and all of the nobility have similar kinds of households. It's true in Europe as well, right? Where they would all have their little writers' workshops, and they're all pursuing these same questions about individuality and the human and idiosyncrasy, which is a very modern concept, humanism. And I frame Jahangir as something of an Enlightenment ruler, because while the Europeans are coming to India in his period of measuring and categorizing, Jahangir's measuring and categorizing too. And his interests are very much the same. He's trying to organize information. Yeah, I think it is a small elite, but the trends are shared.
Is it difficult, when you read his memoir, was it difficult to separate the propaganda, what he wants you to think of him, from what?
You don't. The whole thing is propaganda. The whole thing. So what do you get out? Well, you have multiple people telling the stories of the same events. You can compare those. You can textualize them historically. You recognize the motives for writing. And you also hope to hell that what you're getting is sometimes that he's slipped and he's showing humanity, which I think he does a lot. Babur too. It's like they know they're writing for a public audience, but they forget. And sometimes a little bit of the human being slips out, and you hope you got it. But you're never confident with this stuff, right? That means we have to be very careful.
You mentioned the portrait of Jahangir with his father Akbar, and that's also a European motif where you try, where a king would try to associate with a previous king who's very powerful. So did the other emperors in India do that as well? It wasn't just Jahangir with his father?
Well, this dynasty will do it so much, and it's fascinating because so much of their political legitimacy is drawn from their lineage, right? They are the descendants of the two greatest empire builders in world history, Genghis Khan and Timurid, right? That's fact. They don't need to prove anything. They've got this lineage. So you end up with these amazing genealogical paintings that include multiple generations, sometimes 6 and 8 generations in a single painting, and they're all hanging out together and chatting or having a picnic. But there's a constant referencing back and forth between the generations. Even like Jahangir, there's a wonderful painting in the British Museum, and I wept when I finally got to see it because it's not on display. I had to ask and come in with clean hands, and they took me to a back room, and it's a massive painting that was done by Babur's son's workshop, Humayun, of a bunch of Timurid princes having this big picnic with a pavilion. And then in Jahangir's period, it's been rediscovered in his treasure room, and he has his painters add people to the painting. So it begins to encompass 10 generations, and they're all picnicking together. And so it's so important to him that each individual is recognized, that he actually inscribes the names across the bodies, or his artists do. But at the same time, the painting styles vary dramatically, because some are 16th century and some are 17th century after this European influence. And so it's a hodgepodge. It's not aesthetically very exciting, but when you know the story behind it, it's just heart-stoppingly fabulous. And then when Shah Jahan goes into rebellion, he gets erased and the smudge is there. Susan.
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm just wondering if you can say quickly about what's the relationship between India and China at that time. Is there any significant cultural or any exchange that we should take note?
Yeah, great question. There's not a lot of direct contact in this period, but Chinese goods, porcelains in particular, are really valued. So they turn up a lot in the painting. So we see that a lot of these imports from China have come in. As you know, because Susan and I co-taught together for years with Rich Smith, who's also here, my cohort. We used to explore the exchange of ideas and goods between China and Iran during the late Mongol period. Once the Mongols have conquered their territories and established separate royal courts in China and in Iran, the two brothers who are ruling these sections, Kublai Khan is in China, Hulagu Khan is in Iran, and they're brothers, and they're very close. And they begin trading back and forth, people, goods, armies, administrators, medical treatises, and artists. And so, as we know, the arts in Iran take on many of the motifs and the aesthetics of Chinese painting. So even in Mughal India, this is retained. So sometimes it's hard to know if it's actually Chinese goods or if it's still this lingering motif that is used in these Timurid-Mughal paintings that reference Chinese shapes and ideas. But in terms of political relationships, none. Just lots of good stuff, which is what China's mostly known for in the period.
Dr. Balabanlilar, I would like to thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk with spectacular
Maybe not. Maybe you would all be napping, but I could keep talking for hours, so I'm going to do.
Well, thank you so much. Now, where is here? We have some autograph books to give away to the lucky attendees. I won't look, I'll just grab one. Anne Green, please raise your hand. Brian Donning. Bob Bailio. Bailio. Saurabh Shah. Is that it? One more? Okay. I didn't want to announce a name and find out they were all passed out. And the last, Joseph Campana. Professor. Well, thank you all very much, especially to you, Dr. Balabanlilar.
They prepared so much and spoke about so little, but
I didn't want to stop, but I knew we were having a reception in the reading room for the arts library over there. It's past, go out, it's on this floor, go out this door, straight through to your right. It's pretty much at right angles to where we are here. And thank you all for attending.